While many in the West have heaped praise on Queen Elizabeth II, and thousands line up today to see the Queen lying in state, throughout England's former colonies, some of which fought violent wars to secure their independence during Queen Elizabeth's reign, the reaction is more complicated. Some opponents of the monarchy and well respected journalists are, in fact, calling her colonizer queen. Today, we are asking, how do you pay respect for the dead while reckoning with past wrongs? Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Queen Elizabeth's coffin will be on view in Westminster Hall until Monday, when a state funeral will be held. Mourners have stretched over 10 miles to get a glimpse of the longest running head of state of the British monarchy. Last week's death of Queen Elizabeth II was celebrated by some in the media. Tucker Carlson said she was the last living link to a truly great Britain, and Piers Morgan, as well as Jeff Bezos, are publicly defending the Queen. Now, in contrast, a Pennsylvania professor said she hoped the Queen's final hours of pain were, well, excruciating. Trahaka Love, a writer for the New York Magazine, wrote, quote, "For 96 years, that colonizer has been sucking up the earth's resources. You can't be a literal oppressor and not expect the people you've oppressed not to rejoice on the news of your death," end quote. Harvard professor Maya Jasanoff wrote for the Times last week that it was wrong to romanticize the Queen's rule. She referenced repression in Malaya, Kenya, and Yemen, and said the Queen helped obscure a bloody history of decolonization. Noted journalists Jamel Hill and Eugene Scott also chimed in, saying it was time to talk about colonialism under the Queen. Others say they were thinking of the Queen's treatment of Princess Diana and Meghan Markle. So, what are we to make of the Queen, her legacy, the coverage, and the monarchy? And just why is she such a polarizing figure? Here for my lead-off discussion is Taharka Love. He is a senior writer at New York Magazine, and he's been quite vocal about the Queen and her ties to colonialism. Good morning and welcome, Taharka.
Good morning. It's good to be with you today.
Yeah, so you wrote, you just let it all hang out. You wrote exactly what you were thinking, apparently, about the Queen in this article for the New York Magazine, and I know you've written about her in your newsletter, The Dinner Party. But you faced a great deal of social media backlash for calling the Queen out on her oppressive or her ties to colonialism. Basically, you called her a colonizer. So what prompted you to be so honest about, how you view the Queen?
Well, again, it's great to be here today. But yeah, I would say what prompted me was the historical record, honestly. We're here in America, and as one of Britain's colonies, I feel like we have a very, let's say, distinct perspective on Britain and its empire. So I think it's one part of being like on this continent that we have a relationship with Britain that might be a little bit more antagonistic. But honestly, the historical record, how they dealt with and colonized Africa, how they broke apart Africa in a lot of different ways, how they've stolen resources from multiple nations in their colonizing effort, and specifically with the Queen, just how much they field resistance from different countries like Kenya, like Ghana, when they were fighting for their own decolonization, right? Like there's this idea that the Queen themselves, like the royal family themselves, were the ones who were like, hey, listen, we're done. We're not going to colonize any more nations. And you can say there was a decolonization effort there, but it wasn't as if they were like willingly doing that. The times were changing. Countries were actually resisting. in the 1950s and 60s in a way that was like very different from before. So they sort of like read the tea leaves on that and realized that the royal family had to become a part of Europe. It wasn't something that they willingly did. So for me, it's just sort of like, okay, I'm looking at the historical record. She's a part of this family that is very problematic, both within Britain and outside of it. And I'm just not going to be a person who is about to celebrate this lady. Like, I'm just not going to do that. Like, I couldn't, on good conscience, do that. You know what I mean?
Were you surprised though, Tucker, when you got the kind of social media backlash? Certain newspapers called you out. You were called, a woke liberal. Did that shock you?
No, not really. I mean, being called a woke liberal definitely shocked me because I am neither a liberal nor do I consider myself like a woke person. I don't know what that means. So that part definitely shocked me, but no, it didn't shock me at all. What I would say to them is like I woke up this morning and breathed air and it feels great to be alive and their queen didn't. But more seriously, I guess like people have already pointed out how spots like the Daily Mail and Insider were like cherry picking what Black and brown people said about the queen and not like half the country of Ireland or the Aboriginals in Australia or Argentina, who, if you check their timelines, their TikToks, they were saying way harsher things than I did. Right. Like way harsher things. But the negative response for people on the timeline who I'm sure didn't actually read what I wrote. There was a couple of funny things that happened. Like they kept bringing my grandma into the equation. Like, oh, what if this was your grandmother? I'm like, first of all, the queen is not your grandmother. Can we just like, they're not a part of your family. They're not your blood. But also, damn, like my grandmother never tried to uphold colonial relationships or protect pedophiles or steal resources from the people of Britain and invaluable cultural artifacts for countries all across the world. But I'm sure that like the families of the pests that my grandmother killed in mass to keep the farm that she grew up on humming would just like jitterbug on her coffin if she were to die. And I couldn't hold them up for that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to like look at anyone who's celebrating her death in this way and seeing and understanding the historical record of like mass amounts of genocide, the countless battles that she's had with indigenous people on their own land for their own independence. I'm just not going to celebrate that. But I will also say that I think a lot of people agreed with me. And I had plenty of people from Britain like, yeah, the Queen's a proper hag or what, whatever British people be saying. Like, I don't really know. But even beyond the clearly racist shit, I'm very happy that the Daily Mail is reading Dinner Party. Like they said, I led the ridicule of her reign, which is just a completely fantastic idea in every sense of that word. Because like, who am I? Like, honestly, right. You know what I mean?
Profile for sure. But let me ask you this. Were you surprised to see folks like Tucker Carlson, Piers Morgan, Jeff Bezos? Were you surprised to see how they came to the defense of the Queen? Tucker Carlson saying she was the last living link to a truly great Britain.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, Tucker Carlson is in bed with a brand of white nationalism that is very much aligned with folks who are royalists and are a part of like who have that sort of like monarchy mindset, I would say. So it doesn't really surprise me at all. Jeff Bezos himself. It doesn't surprise me at all that they would align with them. It doesn't surprise me at all that they would go out on social media and say this sort of stuff because, the folks who are in my inbox going wild are, neo-Nazis and white supremacists. You know what I mean? So this doesn't really contradict anything that I've heard from Piers Morgan or Tucker Carlson. This falls right in line with their political views.
Yeah, I want to bring into the conversation Dr. Ava Thompson Greenwell. She's a journalism professor at Northwestern University. She's also the author of Ladies Leading the Black Women Who Control Television News. Good morning and welcome back to the show, Professor Greenwell.
Good morning.
What I'm trying to make sense of is this 24/7 coverage that we've seen. I was actually in St. Louis last Thursday when the news broke that she was near death and then she actually died. And it was like wall to wall coverage from Thursday pretty much through Monday. I think it started to subside a little, Monday, Tuesday. I suspect it'll pick back up over the weekend as they prepare for the funeral on Monday. But what do you make of this coverage, just wall to wall?
I am really unsettled by it. I mean, it's oversaturated to the max. I was in the process of moving, and actually, so I didn't get a chance to hear a lot of it. But what I did hear of it, it was just over the top. And in addition to that, it was very unbalanced. One of the things that we talk about in journalism school is not necessarily objectivity, because that definition, is really changing. But what we talk about is, okay, where are the two sides, the three sides, the four sides? Where is the conversation about colonialism? Where is the mention even of her role in colonialism? I run a program or co-direct a program where we send students to South Africa. And, every time I go, I see the remnants, right, of the British and what they have done as part of, this horrible system of apartheid. And so no mention of that whatsoever. And these are legacy media companies, that hold themselves up to be, the creme de la creme, the media organizations that are supposed to tell it like it is. But the reality is they're not telling the full truth. And it really reminds me of, the missing white woman syndrome, where we see this over coverage of white women who go missing at the expense of covering women of color who go missing. And so, as I said earlier, it's one of those things where it's unsettling and it's just wrong in terms of how we should be covering this story. We really need, we talk about critical race theory, right? And how that impacts the message. In many ways, journalists are teachers. Every day we write, we speak, we record. We are forming people's opinions about topics. And it is so important that we give them everything as much as possible. And it's just not happening.
Yeah, I wonder, do you think, Takara, that the media is leading the sentiment, or they are just reflecting the sentiment of the American public?
Yeah, this question of like the chicken or the egg, right? I always believe that it's the media doing it, though. Like, I think that we just have so much outsized influence on so many different platforms on how people talk about this stuff, that if we don't frame the conversation in a way that is actually expansive and actually considerate of the history of colonization and its happening today, we're doing a disservice to the story completely. And so when I come in and talk about, that I'm dancing on her grave, that's an invitation.
Oh, we're having some
would celebrate in her passing. So, I just find that if you take in a perspective that is saying like, hey, it's totally different from you, and I'm gleeful in this time, I hope it's an invitation for you to learn more about why someone in my position would be happy about that.
Professor Green, why do you think the U.S., that prides ourselves on being this democracy that is, trying to grapple with our own issues of institutional racism, why are we so obsessed with a queen that has this historical record that Mr. Love has been talking about? Why the obsession with a woman who is the symbol of that very thing that we say we are trying to grapple with in our own country?
Well, I wish I had the full answer to that, because I've been asking myself that question for years. Why are we covering this over and over again? Why are we so obsessed? And the only conclusion I can come to is that we are obsessed with whiteness, right? And we are obsessed particularly with white womanhood. And I think if you go back and look at history, you'll see that white womanhood is a thing that is to be valued. It is precious. Again, at the expense of women of color and men of color. And so I think that just permeates a lot of the coverage that we see. And it makes me wonder, really, who's making the decisions, right, behind the scenes. And this is what my book is about, is really looking at when Black women get behind the scenes and they are making the decisions, do they make decisions differently? And what I found was that they tend to be much more balanced, much more fair. Why? Because their lived experiences are ones of being Black women and having been discriminated in this country over and over again, not just because of their color, but also because of their gender. And so that's really the only conclusion I can come to. I mean, we have Queen Elizabeth, a white woman, not only a white woman, but a wealthy white woman. And I think we have to factor in the socioeconomic aspect of this as well, because we know when young wealthy white women go missing, again, they get overrepresentation in terms of coverage. But when the opposite occurs, hardly any coverage.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that about who gets covered. We know, Mr. Love, the issue of Meghan Markle and Harry, the coverage of their wedding, the coverage of the baby that they were expecting. You know, this fear that this baby was going to have this super dark skin, and what, you know, how that would be received by the royal family. And then, you know, Meghan and Harry being pretty open with Oprah in that, you know, that big interview where they said racism was one of the factors that caused them to leave the royal family. So it's not as if the U.S. media hasn't already been exposed to the issue of, you know, how pervasive racism is in Great Britain and particularly in that royal family. So I guess I'm still trying to grapple with why all of this pushback. I watched a journalist like yourself on a cable news station get into a literal shouting match with the host because he refused to allow the host to ask questions about the Queen and her relationship to white supremacy, colonialism, etc. What do you think by now, given Meghan and Harry's revelations, that the media would be more receptive to talking about race and the Queen?
Well, first off, just with Meghan and Harry, I think it's very fascinating that it took them sort of like having to deal with racism directly from those people to understand that this is essentially a racist project. Like the monarchy is essentially a racist project, right? But I would say the obsession around it is very based in the sense of like a lot of the times in situations like this, when a big event like this happens and people have the opportunity to criticize people in power, you notice that a lot of the audience that you're speaking to often aligns themselves with power, right? And it does come back to what Dr. Greenwell was saying, that there is an obsession with whiteness here. And it's an obsession impact Meghan Markle, right? Like they want to separate themselves from the Windsors. They want to separate themselves from the palace and all this sort of stuff, but they are not renouncing their titles. They're not doing anything like that. They're not criticizing the colonial history in a serious way. And when we talk about the colonial history and that it happens even today, we can look to countries like Jamaica, like Antigua, like Trinidad and Tobago, and others who are still in 2022 writing letters to the royal family. This happened in March and in April, basically saying, like, y'all patronize us by saying, oh, slavery and colonization were atrocities, and you recognize racism in your own home, but then you do nothing about it. And then secondly, they're demanding reparations from Europe. And despite how fruitless I might believe those calls will end up being, their frequency and volume from these places that have been colonized is very, very important to signify that the project is.
Yeah, we keep having some difficulty
to talk about colonization in that way, or colonization in that way. And because of that, we often are susceptible to like very surface level readings about what's going on here. So yeah, I think that's really a part of it. Yeah.
Dr. Green, well, help us understand when people die, because I'm thinking back to Gayle King and an interview she was having, you know, talking about Kobe Bryant.
Yes.
And she brought up, you know, Kobe Bryant's
absolutely,
you know, relationship, you know, indiscretion or whatever you want to call it. And people jumped all over Gayle.
They sure did. Including my husband. My husband jumped all over Gayle after that.
All over her.
Right, right.
Snoop had this big battle, and Snoop's mama had to get involved to tell him to calm down and apologize to Gayle. So, you know, it was a thing, right? So, and a lot of what people were saying is, he's dead. Let the man rest in peace. Why are you bringing up this old, you know, dirty laundry when he's done so much good and now he's deceased and his wife is mourning and his, you know, so is there a proper way to cover people who've died?
So again, I go back to the full story, right? People can certainly be redeemed, right, later in life when they do great things. And I think we want to mention that, but we can't mention that only if they did a lot of bad stuff, early on in their life. And so it's really about this balance, this dance of balancing is that, yes, we want to respect the things that the person has done. I mean, for example, when that situation happened with Gayle King, I thought it was okay to ask that question because, that was a question that people were asking, during his life. Now, she didn't spend, the majority of the interview on that, but it was a question that came up, but it created a furor, right? And so when people hold folks in such, almost godlike, right? And they don't want you to say a darn thing about them that might be negative, it's just not true. We all as individuals have positive aspects of our personality and we have negative aspects of our personality. And I think to be really honest about a person, you got to tell it all within the number of words, or the amount of time that you're given from your editors. And so I just really think we need to be more critical thinkers that even in the circumstances of death, that we can learn something from that person's life. We can see that, oh, maybe they started out this way and then something made them change. Something made them be a better person. And I think focusing on both really shows the transition that a person can make. And when we don't do that, we just quash the complicatedness of people and try to make it seem like they're one or the other when none of us, is one of the other. We're all complicated human beings.
All right. So, given what Dr. Greenwell just said, Mr. Love, if you had to write a balanced piece on the Queen, what positive things, if any, could you point to balance out her, relationship to colonialism and the oppression and slavery, which we know is a part of that historical record that the monarchy is trying to quash? But tell us what you would write in, to balance that out.
Well, with this particular queen, she didn't give us a lot. In terms of emotion and in terms of sort of energy, she had a very traditional sort of approach to her reign. So I can say that I'll say that when she figured out that, these countries are probably going to be fighting back against you, you should probably bow out and let this happen. I feel like that was probably clever. That was smart, I guess. But yeah, I don't think she gave us a lot to think about or to ponder outside of the mystique of her reign, right? And I feel like sometimes when we get sort of lost in the mystique and realize that, and we might realize that there's actually nothing behind those eyes. So
okay, Professor Greenwell, Mr. Love is like, I ain't got much for you.
Sorry.
Well, the reason he doesn't have much for you is because she didn't grant any interviews, right? So, not doing that meant that people could never really dig deep. They could never really figure out what her thinking was around this. It was only her spokespeople who might come forward and give us a little glimpse as to what she was thinking. And I think if that is the case, then you have to work with what you have, which is not much, I think, in this particular case. And so, when we think about her legacy and we think about the people who are handling her legacy, unfortunately, now it's going to be up to them, those who are still living, to be able to give us some kind of glimpse into what she was thinking about certain things. Was she thinking about race in a critical way and the role that Britain had taken in colonizing, particularly countries of color? We don't really know because she has never really spoken about that. And so I think that's the furthest we can go. But in the end, I think it's really important for us as journalists to say, okay, now what? What is the next stage? What is King Charles now going to do as it relates to these things? Does he provide any insight into how his mother's thinking actually impacts the way he's going to be thinking? about Britain's role in the future, whether it's reparations or whether it's something else. I mean, I think one of the things we have to do as consumers of all of this is stop becoming so enamored with the photographs, right, of them dressed up in the hats and everything else, and really begin to think about what is their role in making people's lives better. Because that's really what we want to get to, is how can we make life better for people? And what are the solutions that are there? You know, I always like to talk about the invisible power. You know, the power that we don't see is often the most powerful. And my guess would be that's one of the reasons why she didn't give any interviews, right? Is because when you're powerful, you don't need to give any interviews. You can just let people think what they want to think because you know you are still in control.
Yeah, and last question for you, Mr. Love. I assume you're not going to change the way you're covering this story. I assume your newsletter and your opinion pieces are going to remain the same. If you had to say something to those legacy, media outlets, the ones that Professor Greenwell has talked about, who have, been so one-sided in their coverage, what advice would you give them? Because people are reading those stories and walking away with the impression that the monarchy wants people to have. We're going to see these lines stretch 10 miles. We're going to hear people on the streets when they do those on the street interviews just talking in such glowing terms. And what seems like what's happening is that those other voices are being, quieted. So some people may not hear your take. They may not, hear Professor Greenwell's take. So what can those mainstream media companies do to make sure that we have more balance in the story?
Well, it's going to be fascinating for sure, because as we see with Meghan Markle and that whole thing, there's going to be these plays at diversity and inclusion and all sort of stuff in like a more culturally sensitive royal family. And for me, I would just pay attention to what these people do, not what they say, and pay attention to how much money they actually are taking from British people on a regular basis. They're worth like $20 billion, right? Like, so what I would pay attention to is what they do and not necessarily what they say. And for establishment papers, I don't really have a lot of hope for them necessarily, because they are very much an arm of this. They're a part of this. They bank on stories about the royal family. So it's a part of that. But what I would say to writers is seek the truth in the historical record and speak to that.
And Areva, I was going to say, I think he's
losing him. I love what you said, though, about look at what they do, not what they say. Go ahead, Dr. Greenwell. And then I have this question I have to ask you for my daughters, but go ahead, make your point.
And I would just add the same thing for the news managers, right? Let's look at what they do and not what they necessarily have done in the past. And what that means is maybe they need to do a coverage audit and really look at the coverage that they have done over the course of this last week or so, and just really have some real reflection on, did we do a disservice to our viewers, our listeners, our readers? And if so, make those corrections, because there will be other times, right? There are going to be other deaths that come along. And the question is, how are you learning from previous poor coverage that will make it better the next time around and make it more balanced, so that people walk away going, I have a real understanding of this person now. And it's not just that it was all peaches and cream. There was some in those cherries, right? There was some seeds there as well. And I think it's important for us to walk away with that of all of our leaders, right? Because leaders are really a reflection of the people.
Yeah, no, I love what both of you are saying about look at, the actions of a person tell us a lot more than their words. And in the case of Queen Elizabeth, her lack of words tell us not as much as what her actions tell us. But real quickly, before I let you go, Professor Greenwell, Meghan Markle recently made a statement that really ruffled the feathers of young Black women in particular, when she said that it wasn't until she married Harry that Black folks started treating her like a Black woman. I see you shaking your head, Mr. Webb. Did you see that statement, Professor Greenwell?
I had not seen that. Was that the one that interview, the podcast that she did?
Yes, and black women, particularly my daughters, millennial women, they were really that didn't sit well with them. So I was just wondering if you had an opinion on it. You didn't see it. How about you, Basile? Did you hear the statement?
I did hear the statement. I thought it was fascinating. I do want to note that, Meghan Markle is a biracial woman. And so that sort of makes sense. And if we think about whiteness as an identity is defined by a negation, right? So maybe she didn't really see herself in that way. I doubt it personally, but maybe she didn't see herself in that way until she was within this greater backdrop of historic whiteness.
Yeah, I think black women, though, listening to my daughter was like, well, maybe we didn't see you as a black woman because you didn't embrace your blackness. So Professor,
hey,
go find it.
I was going to say, there still is there's still colorism. There's still a preference for whiteness. I mean, that's just the reality in this country. I mean, Meghan Markle matriculated right here at Northwestern University as an undergraduate, where I am now. And I think she was here during the time that I was here, but I'm in a different department. So, of course, I never knew her. But I really think it goes to what your guest just said, is that how does she see herself? Because how you see yourself really determines how you move in the circles that you move in, and how, that can be projected on other people as well. And so, now that the media is, making these statements, though, that just goes to the point of how strong the media is, right? The impact that the media can have on one's own perception of who a person is.
Yeah, I think that was how it was being interpreted. Like, maybe she was saying, I'm not necessarily here for I am, the black woman representative. I don't represent all black women because I've never really saw myself in that light. But it's a fascinating comment. And like I said, the millennial response was very fascinating to me. I have to have both of you back so we can have that conversation. Again, thank you so much. Professor Greenwell's book is
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Women Who Control Television News. Mr. Love, keep writing those hardcore opinion pieces. I love them.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
That balanced reporting. Thanks to both of you for joining me this morning. Okay, we are moving on. We are talking about the monarchy and the way the Queen's death is being covered. My next guest is Dr. Brooke Newman. She's a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth, and she's the author of a new book coming out called The Queen's Silence, The Hidden History of the British Monarchy and Slavery. And also joining me is Peter Tatchell. Peter is a human rights activist and journalist that writes frequently about the monarchy. He was also a candidate at one point for the British Parliament. Good morning, Peter, and good morning, Professor Newman. Just want to start with, Professor Newman, help us understand the role of the Queen in the monarchy, because I think when we think about the Queen, we talk about colonialism and the role that the monarchy played with slavery and colonization. There's sometimes some confusion because, people don't quite get what the Queen's role is vis-a-vis, the British Parliament.
So I think the important thing to know is that the involvement of the British monarchy and the royal family in the slave trade and in colonial slavery goes back hundreds of years to the reign of Elizabeth I. So we're talking about her namesake, Elizabeth I, in the 16th century, giving supplies and ships and her support for an illicit slave trade from West Africa to the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Later in the 17th century, this was crystallized into the formation of the Royal African Company, which was launched by King Charles II and which was headed by his younger brother, James, the Duke of York, the future King James II. He also was the largest shareholder of the Royal African Company. And the Royal African Company would brand his initials into the bodies of enslaved people before shipping them to the New World. So the involvement of the royal family was not just an involvement that was abstract. They were directly involved for a number of centuries, and they also fought initially against the abolition movement to end the slave trade. Queen Elizabeth II herself obviously was not directly involved in any of this, but she is the inheritor of this legacy and of the wealth connected to colonialism, the expansion of the British Empire abroad, of the enslavement of millions of people.
And so I asked this of the journalists in the earlier part of the show, Professor Newman. I'll ask you, given that history and given the US's effort to grapple with institutional racism and its involvement with slavery, why the obsession by Americans with a queen who has ties to that horrific history you just gave us?
The Queen, for many of us, in fact, for most of us, represents a tie to the past. She represents a tie to the post-World War II era. And she was a symbol of refined stability and almost a timelessness in an era of rapid change through multiple wars, through pandemics, through technological innovations, and more. And I think that it's important to also keep in mind that even though Americans have rejected monarchy, we've rejected, in theory, the idea of hereditary privilege, of being in a place based on your bloodline. At the same time, we have our own deep and dark history of slavery and its legacies in this country. And so I think looking at someone like the Queen and being obsessed with the royals has in some ways more to do with a vicarious thrill of fantasizing about monarchy and its privileges, like the crown, for example, and the thought of having this wealth and this privilege, rather than it does in taking seriously and grappling with the legacies of colonialism and slavery, in addition to the fact that much of this history was not taught in American schools and also in British schools and also throughout the Caribbean.
Wow. Okay. So we've compartmentalized the Queen and we romanticize the wealth and the refinement. And, we love that part of her. And we've just kind of whitewashed and dismissed the horrors of slavery and her ties and her family's ties to that. So, Peter, you've written a couple of articles that I've read where you say the monarchy by default is racist. Explain that.
Well, in the United States, you have the opportunity to elect your head of state, the president. And if you don't like your president, you can vote him or her out of office. You can replace them. But under the British system, our head of state is vested in the monarch. And the monarch is vested through the Windsor family, the white Windsor family, or the leading white members of that family. It passes from the firstborn to the next firstborn. So right now, given Meghan Markle aside, and she's a distant, way out in the outer limits of potential monarchy, at the moment, there is no prospect in the foreseeable future, in my lifetime or yours, that Britain could ever have a non-white head of state, because that position is reserved to the Windsor family and all the immediate people in line for succession. They are all white. And I find that incredibly offensive. The idea that no Black or British person, no matter how worthy, no matter how moral and ethical, and no matter how much they've achieved, they can never be our head of state. That's profoundly offensive, and it is racist.
And that would be true, Peter, of anyone that's not somehow, finds himself lucky enough to marry into that family. So you could be the brightest, the most talented, the most skilled person, but yet if you're not lucky enough to get married to a Windsor, you never will be a part of this monarchy. So help us understand that, Professor Newman. That seems so out of step with the concept of democracy. This notion that only one family, not even like 10 families, one family line controls that position forever.
This is a 1,000-year-old archaic institution, and it is rooted in medieval concepts of hereditary privilege, of blood, and of royal blood as being separate and sacred and superior, not just to the subjects that the monarchs rule over, but also from the rest of humanity. They are in many ways an anachronism in the 21st century. And I honestly believe that they know that. They will never admit this, but they know this. And this is why there is so much emphasis on the ceremonial theater of the Queen's death and on the transition to the next monarch and the significance of the pomp and the ceremony and the grandeur is to, in some ways, overawe us to the point that we don't question why this institution has survived. We don't question the inequality inherent in the institution and everything that it represents. But I do think that the response to the Queen's death, the voices of dissent that we are hearing, these are very important voices. And not only should we be listening and talking about it, but the royal family should be listening too, especially King Charles.
Yeah, let's talk about King Charles, Peter. So we know King Charles is nowhere near as popular as his mother. We know he's spoken out on some issues, climate change in particular, and there's some thinking that he's going to face a level of resistance that his mother did not face. What position is Charles going to be in? Can he speak out against things like climate change and maintain the position of king?
But of course, the constitutional position of the monarch as head of state is to remain neutral, above politics, above controversy, to not have opinions. And indeed, that was a hallmark of the reign of Elizabeth II. She had no opinions. She never expressed them anyway. So I think with King Charles, the issue is, of course, he has a long controversial history. And on some issues, like against industrial farming and on protecting the environment and climate change, I think he's been quite progressive. But on others, on modern architecture and homeopathy and various other things, there's a great welter of controversy and dispute. Now, as head of state, he has now given an undertaking that he will not engage in further public pronouncements on controversial political type issues. We'll wait and see whether he sticks to that. But regardless, there is a fear that given his past attempt to interfere in politics, that he may do so behind the scenes when the public doesn't know about it. So in the past, it was eventually revealed that he used to write letters to various prime ministers and government ministers seeking a change of policy. He's saying he's not going to do that anymore, but how do we know? All these exchanges are private, and unless there's a whistleblower around, we will never know. Yeah. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that his position as head of state is very much contingent on public consent. Well, he's going to rule if he has no public consent. But recently, in the last few days, he has been working the crowds, as has been mentioned, doing all the pomp and circumstance to try and cement himself as the rightful heir, to project himself as being a continuation of his much-loved mother. Now, that does seem to be working, because even just some weeks ago, his popularity ratings were quite low, but now they've suddenly risen. And I've got to say that the media coverage here, which has been non-stop for a week now, almost no other news reported, many programs and events axed. The long shot is that his standing is rising, and that's because the media is acting as a PR exercise, a promotional vehicle for the royal family. It's not objectively reporting the news. It's basically following the PR handouts from Buckingham Palace and giving the king free PR.
Yeah, Professor Newman, I was, asking Professor Greenwell about that, the coverage in the U.S. Are you surprised that the U.S. coverage has been both nonstop and has been this kind of romanticized coverage of the Queen? Because there must be offenses that the news could cover other than the relationship to slavery. So tell us, one, are there other things that we should be focused on that the Queen is responsible for, either by acts of overt acts or, acts of just complicity? And what about this coverage?
I'm not surprised at all by the coverage in the United States. This has been a media storm in the making. People have been preparing for her death for years. I was contacted a year ago when the Queen's health was declining and asked to give interviews for stories that would come out as soon as she died. So this has been, people have been sitting on stories about the Queen and her legacy for years. And everyone knows that people will be paying attention to not only the Queen and her legacy and her death and the funeral and everything else, but what happens next with King Charles. And I also think, I just wanted to add a quick note here, that the significance of the national period of mourning, I think we shouldn't underestimate that, because this is a concerted campaign, both to honor the demise of a sovereign and obviously in doing so to cement the value and the continued significance of the institution of the monarchy in the 21st century and beyond. But it's also about the making of a king, the making of a new king, and hoping to garner public sympathy for him and have his poll numbers rise. He is one of the least popular members of the royal family, and he has been for a number of years, not least because of all of the scandals connected with him and his treatment of Princess Diana. So I think this is something that in Britain in particular has been carefully orchestrated and planned for decades. It's important. The British need to be seen as knowing what they're doing. The institution itself owes its survival to these kinds of deals with the media. At the same time, the voices of dissent that we're hearing that are saying, well, wait a minute, what about what has happened, not just in the past involving members of the royal family and the monarch, but also in the 20th century? These are important voices that we should be listening to as well. The Queen, we will never know for sure, because many of these conversations that she had with prime ministers, for example, were private or were not recorded. But we do know that in some cases, the Queen was unaware of atrocities that were committed in her name. However, atrocities that were committed in Kenya, for example, shortly after she took the throne and the Mau Mau uprising, she did become aware of these atrocities during her lifetime. And at the same time, she chose not to grapple with the colonialist past of the monarchy and also crimes against humanity that were occurring during her reign and in her name. And I think that is why her legacy is mixed.
And so, Peter, we know there's been a cry for reparations. Many countries that the British Empire, have just raped and robbed of their resources are calling for reparations. Do you think King Charles, now King Charles, takes any action, does anything to try to make those countries like Jamaica, make those countries whole? Do they return anything like the jewels in the Queen's crown or any of the diamonds or the other, the wealth that they've stolen?
Well, you're absolutely right. The wealth of Britain was initially prime-propped centuries ago by colonialism and by the slave trade. Great cities like Liverpool, Manchester, London, Bristol were built on the slave trade and the wealth that it generated. So, in many senses, the slave trade and colonialism gave the financial jumpstart for the Industrial Revolution, which pushed Britain to become the workshop of the world in the 19th century. So certainly we owe a great debt, a huge debt. And there is, of course, and have been many calls for reparations. That is not something that Prince Charles, or now King Charles, has the capacity to deliver, because he is a titular ceremonial head of state. Except that there are certain reserve powers. And you mentioned earlier about the lack of critical appraisal. It's only in the last 2 years it's come out that both the Queen and Charles used an arcane procedure called Queen's consent over 1,000 times to block laws that would have had an adverse effect upon their own estates and wealth. Now, these included things like health and safety, environmental protection, the right of tenants to buy their own properties, all these kind of things, over 1,000 times. And of course, King Charles inherited his mother's vast wealth without paying a penny in inheritance tax because he's exempt. Nobody else is exempt, but he's exempt. And, the Duchy of Lancaster alone, which is a private, income, is valued at about £650 million. When the Queen Mother died, she had a vast estate which included a collection of Fabergé eggs. The Queen got all of those inheritance tax free. So this is an example of a still very privileged family that is able to intervene in politics and get their way.
Yes. Okay. So, Professor Newman, Peter is saying, hey, the monarchy gets involved in the governance of Britain and its colonies when it's to their financial advantage. Peter just said over 1,000 times that they intervened to prevent laws from being enacted that may have impacted their financial wealth. One, we don't hear a lot about that. This is news that Peter is breaking to me, and I'm sure lots of viewers. So Charles does have a choice, and Queen Elizabeth too had a choice, to not continue to live on the wealth that was stolen from these countries, to distribute it, to walk away the way Harry did. So talk to us about these choices, because it's presented in a way that suggests, oh my God, constitutionally, they can't talk about politics. They're just these symbolic heads of states. They're just powerless. They just have to sit there and be showered with all this wealth. That's kind of how the story is being fed to us. But that's not the true story.
Right. That's absolutely the case. They have a choice, despite the fact that a constitutional monarch is meant to remain politically neutral. They obviously have not in certain cases when it has been to their benefit. But more importantly, to acknowledge the historical record, to point out what has occurred, who has benefited, and to apologize and to, for example, reach out to CARICOM and say, what should the next steps be? How can we, as in concert with the British government, help you? How can we help you? You have been our subjects for a number of centuries. You were enslaved, you were subjugated, and you were subject to inequality that still affects you to this day. How can we help you? How can we repair that damage? That is a choice that Queen Elizabeth could have made and chose not to make, and that Charles chose not to make. Likely, this has to do with how willing they are to determine if reparations and an apology for slavery helps their agenda. Is it going to help ensure the survival of the institution that they embody? If they don't think that it will, if they think that it'll actually decrease the chances that this institution will survive, they will not take these steps. In addition, though, they don't want to draw negative attention to themselves. So they're much more likely to deliver speeches as Charles did and Prince William did in Ghana, in Rwanda, in Jamaica, and Barbados, where they admit that slavery was an atrocity, slavery never should have happened, that this is a dark history. At the same time, they would rather draw attention to Britain and the royal family's involvement in the abolition movement, because that is a positive story. It puts both the country and the royal family in a positive light. This is good PR. Apologizing for slavery, they probably are not sure how people would respond to that it might be politicized. But I think that people who are currently living in the Commonwealth realms that have not severed ties with the crown yet, places like Jamaica, St. Kitts, other Caribbean nations, for them, this is a crucial issue. It's not abstract. Their ancestors were enslaved. Inequality was inherited over time. The enslavers in the 19th century, they they were compensated by the British government, and it took until 2015 for that loan to be paid off. And so the descendants of enslaved people living in modern Britain helped to pay off the debt of slavery to slave owners and not to the enslaved and their descendants. This is a crucial point, and it is something that I honestly can't keep repeating enough because I think it's so important.
No, and I'm glad you said that. People don't know that Britain paid a debt to the slave owners,
Yes,
not the slaves themselves. And now you're telling us that it is the descendants of the slaves who helped pay off the debt to the folks that owned their ancestors. That is so twisted. It's just so unbelievable. Peter, how can this racist privilege club continue? Will it survive? Will the monarchy survive as the younger generation of people who are not brainwashed in the way that their parents were? I interviewed a historian. He started the first Black African studies, Black studies class in Great Britain, because the history, as Professor Newman said, has been so whitewashed. They don't even, write about or talk about the British involvement with slavery. He said it's kind of like, that happened over there. We are abolitionists and we were opposed to slavery. How long can this monarchy survive? Social media, movements around the world to address institutional racism, the movements that are happening right here in the US. Can the monarchy survive this kind of, awareness of these atrocities?
Well, certainly the typical polls show that the monarchy still has about 2/3 support among the British people. 2/3. That means 1/3 are either opposed or skeptical or indifferent. I think when it comes to younger people, there is more skepticism and even opposition to the monarchy, but it's still not huge. It's just that the whole culture of this country, Britain, and its media and its institutions is geared to royal deference. And the royal family symbolize the class system. They are the pinnacle of the class system. They represent this society, which is based upon, some people, a very small number of people at the top, very, very privileged, and the vast majority not so. And it's all the more outrageous that this incredible wealth is on show and this incredible extravagance is taking place at a time when we are living through a catastrophic cost of living crisis, where people in Britain, poor people, are being forced to choose between eating and heating their homes. It is going to be a monstrous winter with many thousands of people are going to die because our energy bills have gone up astronomically by more than 300% in the last year. And that is putting incredible strain on families at a time when we're venerating this extremely privileged, wealthy family. I mean, the royal family have between them 23 castles, palaces, and royal residence. 23. They have over 1,000 servants. Their combined wealth is in excess of £1,000 million. This is completely out of touch with modern Britain and what we aspire to, ostensibly, a fair and equal society.
Last question for you, Professor Newman. I mean, these numbers, these facts are just jaw-dropping, shocking, startling. Can you envision a world where there is no monarchy?
I can definitely envision a world without monarchy. Do I think that world is coming in the near future? No. I think it will take time. I think it will take world events, and it will take a groundswell of criticism against the royal family over time to build to where you see these numbers change, to where you have a flip where 2/3 of people are against the monarchy and 1/3 are hoping it will survive. I also think it will depend increasingly on the loss of an aging population, demographic shifts, a more diverse population, asking does this family represent me? Does it represent my interests? Is this what we want to stand for? Which in many ways, Queen Elizabeth was the face of Britain. When people thought about the British, when they thought about even the British Empire, despite the fact that it was dissolving under her watch, they thought of her. Now that she is gone, I think that there will be a chipping away of support for the royal family, but I don't see the monarchy itself dissolving anytime soon. However, I do believe that William, whenever he takes the throne, as many years away as that may be, will inherit far fewer Commonwealth realms where the monarch is still recognized as head of state. And so I do think British influence will continue to shrink. And as Britain grapples with its own identity in the post-Brexit era, in the midst of all of these crises, I think they're going to have to ask themselves, who do we want to be? Is this family, this very privileged white family, wealthy family, who will not apologize, who will not use even a fraction of their wealth to help fight inequality, is this the family that we want to continue to support? And do we want to continue to pay for them via our taxpayer dollars?
And just quickly, Professor Newman, to end the monarchy, would that be something that would have to happen with the British Parliament? Is that, because it's constitutionally established? Would there have to be some kind of constitutional amendment?
Yes. And the last time there was the downfall of the monarch lost his head. So Charles I. And it's interesting that Charles decided to name himself Charles III. I know a number of historians were sort of snickering about the connection to his namesake losing his head back in the 17th century. So hopefully Charles will keep an eye on that.
Wow, so fascinating. Thank you so much, both of you, Peter and Professor Newman, enlightening us on the royal family and the monarch. It's fascinating history. Still don't quite get why America is so, why our coverage of this is so saturated. But, until probably next week, we should expect to see wall-to-wall coverage of the Queen's death and of her burial and of the transition of power to Charles III. Again, thanks both of you for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All my guests. What an interesting topic. If you are wanting more information, follow Peter, follow Professor Newman, follow Mr. Love, who writes for the New Yorker magazine, follow Professor Greenwell. All of these experts and historians have such interesting takes on what's happening in Great Britain with respect to the monarchy. Just some words to live by. I think I'm just myself still so fascinated by all the great history that we learned this morning. Desmond Tutu famously said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." That's a message for you, King Charles. Be safe out there, and remember, we're all in this together.